I have a question for you guys. Who is the most influential music act of all time?
Slayer.
Pink Floyd.
Beatles.
All these different ideas out there. I'll tell you guys something. Mariah Carey, Whitney Houston, people you guys talked about, Michael Jackson, Elvis, all these people had numerous #1 hits. They had a lot of influence on other musical acts, of course, but nobody's had more #1 hits than the Beatles. The Beatles had 20 #1 hits in their 6 or 7 years of recording time together. Guys, my name is Tim Moore, and today I'm going to tell you about the most influential music act of all time, the Beatles. And specifically, I'm going to tell you about their initial success and how popular they were when they first hit the scene, and also their influence on popular culture in their time, but more importantly, to today, in our time. You'll see references to them all over the place. First off, let me go back to those 20 #1 hits they had. The Beatles started off in 1964, and in that first year that they started releasing music to the public, they had 6 #1 hits. That's a record. During the next 7 years that they were together, they were putting out music. When they had those 20 #1 hits, they had 3 #2s that only failed to reach #1 because they held the #1 spot. They also had the most #1 albums of all time, with 19 #1 albums across 4 generations, or 4 decades, excuse me. They had the most consecutive #1 albums in the Billboard album charts, with 8 consecutive #1 albums. They had the most songs inside the Billboard Hot 100 at the same time, with 14. That was in 1964 when they first came out. Can you imagine that? 14 songs of theirs were in the top 100 songs of the country. That's just an incredible amount. They also had the most chart entries in the Billboard Hot 100 within a calendar year. In a 1-year period of time, they had 30 songs chart on the Billboard Hot 100. And they also they're the only band, the only musical act ever, to hold all top 5 spots. So they had the #1, the #2, the #3, #4, #5, and that was also in 1964 when they first came out in stateside. Of course, those are all really impressive stats, and especially when you consider that they had this much success in about a 10-year, not even 10-year time period. And when you have that much success in such a short amount of time, it affects the lives of millions and millions and millions of people, right? And those people listen to your music, they love your music, and they go on. So even though the Beatles broke up in 1971, the people who loved their music continued on, and they carried on with their lives, and through the generations, they put out and they created things that were directly influenced by the Beatles, more than just music. So for instance, you may have seen commercials recently. There was a Target commercial that featured a song by the Beatles, Hello Goodbye. You may have seen an MJR commercial recently that featured a song by the Beatles, All Together Now. There was a Beatles rock band video game on Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, and the Wii. A very famous director named Julie Taymor, who brought you movies like Frida or Titus, or she also brought The Lion King to Broadway, created a movie called Across the Universe. I think it was in 2008. And that movie was almost a musical based only on Beatles music. So the lyrics of Beatles songs created the script of this movie, 40 years after the Beatles had recorded their music. Aside from that, you may have seen the Beatles popping up in The Simpsons. All the 3 living Beatles at the time, George Harrison, Ringo Starr, and Paul McCartney, had appeared in separate episodes of The Simpsons, lended their voices to their Simpson character. John Lennon appeared, although he was murdered in 1980. He appeared as an angel with a sound-alike in an episode of The Simpsons. On Nickelodeon, there's a show called SpongeBob SquarePants, and this is a show that appeals to children, of course. You probably have you love SpongeBob. Who mostly appeals to children, but there's still Beatles references in there. There's one episode where Plankton, a band in the show, has a hit album named Krabby Road, which is a direct reference to the Beatles album Abbey Road, and it's a very famous cover. You've probably seen it, with the 4 Beatles are walking across the street. and they do that pose in the TV show, which is really cool. Sesame Street, come on, we all grew up on Sesame Street, right? They have a parody group called the Beatles, but spelled differently, and they sing songs like Let Her Be instead of Let It Be, or Hey Food instead of Hey Jude, which is really cool. And finally, I know we all watched Friends at some point in our lives, right? Phoebe, when she got married, her wedding song was an instrumental version of Here, There, and Everywhere, another popular Beatles song. So in conclusion, I hope I showed you today that the Beatles are the most influential musical act of all time. Their stunning success inspired people for generations, and those people became creators themselves, and not only in music, but they also created things that reference the Beatles as far as movies, TV shows, video games, board games, art, and all sorts of things. And that is why the Beatles are the most influential musical act of all time.
Questions?
They had a cartoon too when I was a kid. I used to watch it.
Yeah, the Beatles actually had their own cartoon in the olden days.
Summary.
Yeah, I never actually seen it. I've seen
No, it
clips
was
of it.
just a cartoon.
Yeah, it was like the four of them,
Yeah.
the actual characters.
Just doing the.
Right, like it wasn't yeah, even like a reference, right?
Did they do all their own writing?
Pretty much, it was mostly Lennon and McCartney wrote pretty much all their own songs, although they did kind of steal from some people at times, and they did some covers. George Harrison wrote a few really popular songs. I was going to talk about, but didn't have time, but one of his songs is called Something, and Frank Sinatra, I'm sure you guys heard Frank Sinatra. He is quoted as saying that Something is the greatest romance song of all time. You know.
When did Pete Best get kicked out?
That was before they hit it big time in 1964, and he actually did drum on some of their big hits, like I Want to Hold Your Hand, not I Want to Hold Your Hand, Love Me Do, I think it was. And he never received any real royalties until the 90s when the Beatles released their anthology project, which released the recordings that he played on, and then he actually became rich, like in the 90s, off those recordings, which is kind of cool.
Are the three of them still alive, or is one of them dead?
George Harrison died in 2005, I think it was, of cancer, lung cancer, and John Lennon was murdered, of course.
Well, yeah.
And Ringo and Paul McCartney are still going strong.
Okay.
Another thing I was going to talk about, but didn't have time, was Paul McCartney still tours and sells out, and I don't have the stats on me, but he makes a ton of money off his
But
live
he's really
concerts.
dead, so.
Right, yeah, Paul is dead. That's a hoax, guys. That happened in the 60s, but anyway, I don't know a lot about that. Anything else? Anybody listen to the Beatles? Listen to
No.
the Beatles.